I'm curious about how you think all of this went down today. Hegseth was questioned over his drinking habits, the 2017 sexual assault allegation, his stance on women in combat, and his qualifications to run a department with 3 million employees. Yet he picked up Senator Ernst's support today. Does that surprise you at all?
No, it doesn't, Laura, but I think it does disappoint me and most objective and independent folks who care deeply about our national security and our troops and our national defense. Nothing about today was normal. The whole thing was unprecedented on a level we've never seen. I think most of all because so much of it was focused on his character and whether he's fit for this job, which is not something we normally have to take into account when we're vetting a Secretary of Defense. I mean, we're curious about whether or not he might pass an FBI check. This is, the same job that was filled in the past by people who had been the director of the CIA, people who had been U.S. senators. So the fact that such a focus was on his character and his integrity and things like whether or not he would get drunk on the job and his adultery and his honesty, I think is really a dark point for our national security and for our troops, and the most hyper-partisan and really extremely political hearing for a Secretary of Defense we've ever seen. Now, Hegseth is a very political, I would argue, extreme political nominee, but that's usually not the case for a Secretary of Defense. This is usually the bipartisan job, the place that's supposed to be immune from all our politics. But we saw the worst of our division and our partisanship on full display here, and unfortunately, ultimately, our troops and our national security are at the center of all of it. But Joni Ernst moving was expected because there's been so much tremendous pressure from Trump, from the MAGA base, and from the right to move her because she's a sexual assault survivor herself. She's a combat veteran herself, and her influence is tremendous. So it looks like now with her caving that his nomination will go through. There's still a week to go, and anything could come out, but it does look like he's on a path to confirmation.
Well, Lieutenant, just so I'm clear, is the focus on his character and his integrity, is that problematic to you because those ought to be the bare minimum, or the kind of the floor, not the ceiling in the consideration of somebody? Is that the novelty of it, or is the fact that they focused on the wrong things and should have talked about something else?
No, I think they had to focus on this. I mean, because of all the reporting and the allegations and his inexperience. But I think, what I look at, Laura, is if we think about a cabinet secretary, you should give it kind of maybe at a minimum the principal school test. Like, would you be okay with someone who has these kind of allegations and this kind of a track record, a sloppiness at best in their personal history if they were the principal of your kid's school? And if not, then why are we okay with that person heading our Department of Defense with 2 million employees and a $700 billion budget and our nukes? This is a sacred obligation, and this is a critically important place to have a person with honor, integrity, and courage, and a degree of nonpartisanship where they can rise above the politics and put our national security and our troops first. And what you really saw is a culture war, and you saw a culture warrior in Pete Hegseth bringing that culture war to the Department of Defense, to the Pentagon, and to this nomination, and the Democrats fighting back, and I would argue pretty fecklessly. I mean, the other thing you saw here is the Democrats look shattered, they look leaderless, they look ineffective, and it feels like the Trump steamroller ran them over today and is picking up steam.
So how should the Democrats, in your opinion, have conducted themselves? We did see, of course, some pretty fiery exchanges and the insistence on the answering of questions, but how do you think the Democrats should have handled it? What were the questions they ought to have honed in on?
I think it starts with who's on the committee. I mean, the Democrats here only had, I think, 2 combat veterans that sat on that committee. So you don't have a lot of depth of experience in the military, personal experience, where they can actually confront someone like Pete Hegseth, who served in the military honorably and who's been in combat. So I think it starts with that. But there wasn't really a united message. It didn't feel like anybody could get Hegseth on the ropes, with the exception of maybe Tim Kaine and Kirsten Gillibrand. But many of them felt like they weren't prepared. They weren't really aggressive. And they didn't ask critical questions. Like, are you going to put the Constitution first, or are you going to put Donald Trump first? I think that's the real core question here, especially if we talk about potential deployment of U.S. troops on U.S. soil, whether or not Trump will use them to tackle the migrant crisis. We're going to face some very serious issues.
There was a point, I don't want to cut you off, Lieutenant, but there was a point, I got to get to this, there was where he was asked whether he'd follow certain controversial, or I know our time is limited, but I want to play for you and the audience what he had to say about this exchange. Listen.
Would you carry out an order from President Trump to seize Greenland, a territory of our NATO ally Denmark, by force, or would you comply with an order to take over the Panama Canal?
Senator, I will emphasize that President Trump received 77 million votes to be the lawful commander-in-chief of this country.
We're not talking about the election.
There was another instance when he was asked about whether he would follow an unconstitutional order as well, and he skirted the issue many believed. Do you think that that was indicative of his inclination to follow an order like that?
I think what it revealed is that Pete Hegseth is not going to answer the question. He was very slippery and dicey throughout it, but it's clear that he's going to follow what Donald Trump wants him to do. I think he made it clear to any objective watcher that his loyalty is to Donald Trump and executing his agenda. When you try to drill down on specifics, he often dodged it. He deferred. This is a person who's built for television, who's an excellent communicator, and we saw that today. And the Democrats didn't really have an answer for him. So I think at the core of this, his qualifications, his ideas on Iran, what he wants to do about the Arctic, his position on nukes, or how he feels about our naval positioning. None of that even came up because they were so mired in the personal issues, which they had to be, but there also wasn't even a pivot into the larger macro global policy issues that our military is facing every day, from the migrant crisis to wildfires here at home. The Department of Defense touches all those things, and they didn't really get into any of it.